Hi, welcome to the part 6 of this introduction to calcium nutrition of apples. In this presentation, I'll be talking about soil and how that can affect the availability of calcium for plant uptake. This figure shows the map of the United States, overlaid by the dominant soil orders. You can see right away that there's a lot of variability in soil orders throughout the United States. And here, if you look at the soil in Washington State, where a lot of apples are being grown, the soil there is a lot different than that of the Michigan and New York. When we drill down to the field level, as you can see here, you can see that each of these numbers represent each of the soil type, as can be seen in the table here. You can see that within a small area here, you can have up to 10 different soil types. And as I mentioned earlier, soil type can affect how plants take up calcium. You can check your soil type here in this website, Web Soil Survey by the USDA, to see for yourself what type of soil you have in your orchards. Different soil will usually have different texture as well, and soil texture can be described as having different particle size composition. Within the soil, there's usually sand, silt, and clay. And as you can see here, sand being the largest particle, silt somewhere in between, and clay and humus are the smallest particles. Sometimes when you have soil with high organic matter, it can be described as being a different soil type as well. Most of the apples in Washington State are being grown in a sandy type soil. Here's an example of what a sandy loam soil looks like. And in order to determine that, you can use what's called the soil texture triangle. For example, a soil with 60% sand, 15% clay, and 25% silt would put you right in the sandy loam section. Apples in Washington are also grown in loamy sand and sandy soil. But for this presentation, I'll be talking mostly about the sandy loam soil. It is very important to know what soil type you have when growing apples for many reasons. Some of the reasons are drainage, water holding capacity, and nutrient holding capacity. Here's an electron microscope image of clay particles. Clay particles are so small that you can't see with the naked eye. But in this image, you can see what they look like. Basically, they look like a whole bunch of little plates stuck together. And clays are referred to as being chemically active, and because nutrients can actually hang on to them. When we look at sand are inert, and generally, sand does not hold very much nutrient. If you're curious to find out your soil texture, or the percent sand, clay, and silt, you can run the test yourself using these graduate cylinders. You can see here in this cylinder, the soil mixed with the water, you can see that a lot of sand settled right there. So this is a fairly sandy soil. Now, if you look over here, you can see that we have a lot of sand at the bottom, you have some silt settling, and a lot of clay that are still suspended in the solution. And from this, you can determine the soil texture using this soil texture triangle. Here's a prime example to show you what the sandy loam soil looks like. You can see that you have a lot of sand, you have some silt, and very little bit layer of clay settling right there. Compared to this one right here, where you see you have a lot of clay suspended in the solution. And here's an up-close picture, again, of the electron microscope image of what clay particles look like. And within these clay particles is where the nutrients get attached to. the cation nutrients, that is. Cations has positive charge and is attracted to the negative surface of the clay particles. Here's an illustration that I made that shows you the clay plate with a negative charge on it. Now, if you look between the layers of the clay, you can see all these nutrients that are sandwiched between the layers. These nutrients here becomes available to the plants very slowly over time. They're considered generally a reserved nutrients within the clay particles. Now, if you look at the nutrients that are attached on the outside edge of the clay, these nutrients has the ability to get kicked loose from that charge and goes into the soil solution. This exchange of nutrients between the clay particle and the soil solution is called the cation exchange capacity. It is this cation exchange that allows the plant to take up by the roots the nutrients that are in the soil solution. Different soil will have different cation exchange capacity, or the ability for the soil to hold nutrient. Obviously, soil with higher clay content will have higher cation exchange capacity and nutrient holding capacity. And soil with lower clay content, for example, the sandy soil, will have much lower cation exchange capacity or the nutrient holding capacity. Here's a table provided by Yara, which shows you the different cation exchange capacity for different soil texture. You can see here that the sand has the lowest cation exchange capacity compared to clay and organic matter soil. This organic matter soil can be found in places like the Sacramento Delta. There's a high deposit of peat. In Washington State, this is where we're at normally. This light loam soil with the cation exchange capacity about 10. Here's a table I put together to compare the differences in nutrient holding capacity between the two soil types. Here we have the sandy loam soil from the central Washington with lower CEC of about 10. And we have the higher clay content soil in the Midwest with a higher CEC of about 20. Another thing to note here is that soil in central Washington where apples are being grown generally have a pH of higher than 7, compared to the clayer soil Midwest with a pH of lower than 7. The difference here is that the growers in the Midwest tends to add lime to the soil to bring up the pH, where the grower in Washington is not uncommon to see them applying sulfur to try and lower the pH. Now, if we focus on the subject of this presentation, you can see, look at the calcium value here. Calcium value in the soil is generally much higher than all of these other cation nutrients in the soil. Even though calcium value is much higher, plant uptake of nutrients is very selective, and the plants tend to take up a lot more potassium than they do of calcium. And that is why I'm adding this other column here. This is what's called the base saturation percentage of the soil. And you can see the percentage difference between all of these nutrients. And in order to maximize plant uptake of calcium, you have to make sure that your base saturation is at the correct levels. And I'll touch on that a little bit more later. I'm showing you in this table is the nutrient removal by the crop every year. And I'm using an example of a Golden Delicious apples with 80 bins per acre crop, or about 35 tons. Now, if you look down here, you can see that the fruit itself removed about 70 pounds of potassium per acre. Or if you look at the whole tree, that including the fruit, the leaves, and the woods, that crop needed about 101 pounds of potassium per acre to grow. When you compare that to the calcium, you can see a much lower value of calcium of 35 pounds per acre needed for the growth. Now, if you remember the previous slide, there's a lot more calcium in the soil. However, the plant uptake of nutrients is selective. As you can see here, the plant is taking up more potassium than it does for the calcium. And that is why it's important to balance the soil cations in order to optimize the calcium uptake. You want to make sure that the crop is not taking potassium more than it needs, and that is taking up as much calcium into the crop as possible. There has been a lot of research done in agriculture that looked at the cation balance in the soil, because it is the balance of this cation nutrients in the soil that influences how a plant take up nutrients into the crop. With apples, there's a lot of emphasis on calcium because fruit quality of apples has a lot to do with the amount of calcium that's in the fruit. So a lot of work has been done to find the optimal ratios of these nutrients in the soil that would actually maximize the uptake of the calcium into the fruit. And so an agronomist that works on apples here in Washington State might be looking at balancing the soil cations a little bit differently than, say, an agronomist who works on corn or soybean. And as you may recall, there's a lot more calcium in the soil than potassium, but the plant will take up a lot more potassium than calcium. And by balancing the nutrient certain way in the soil, you can actually maximize the uptake of the calcium into the fruit. I'm including this table just to show you the different mechanisms in which the plant takes up calcium versus potassium. Potassium, most of it gets taken up by the plant through the mechanism called the diffusion, and some of it gets taken up via mass flow. But how the diffusion works is you have an area in the soil with a high concentration of potassium, normally where the fertilizer was applied. And that high concentration area of potassium would diffuse into a lower concentration area, or perhaps to the roots. And the roots are able to take up most of the potassium that way. So as long as the soil has high concentration of potassium, the roots will be able to pick up those potassium with ease. Calcium, on the other hand, is a mass flow nutrient, which means that the calcium moves into the plant mostly with water. So you have to have abundant supply of calcium in your soil solution in order to get adequate calcium uptake. If you have dry soil, it would limit your calcium uptake. And if you have imbalance of cations in the soil, you can limit either the uptake of the calcium or potassium. Another factor that facilitates the plant uptake of the potassium in the soil solution more so than calcium is the adsorption strength of the nutrients to the soil particle. Here we see the potassium. Potassium has less of adsorption strength to the soil particle than calcium does. What that means is that when the roots comes in and exudes organic acids in an attempt to dislodge nutrients from the soil particles, potassium is a lot more likely to get dislodged into the soil solution and taken up by the roots more so than calcium does, because calcium is hanging on to the soil particles a lot more tightly than potassium. So far, I've shown that the soil can contain different amount of each of the cation nutrient, and that those nutrients are holding on to the soil at different capacity. To further complicate the matter, there are different mechanisms in which each of the cation nutrient get taken up by the roots. So you may ask, how can I possibly know what to do to make my apples happy? Well, luckily, scientists have been hard at work and has come up with some numbers to help growers raise better crop. However, these numbers right here was not developed specifically for apples, but for general purpose reasons. But the good news is that these numbers can be tweaked to suit your soil type or crop being grown. For example, it is generally recommended that on higher CEC soil, you want to be at the upper end of the range. For example, 80% calcium, 15% magnesium, 3% potassium. And for the low CEC soil, it's generally recommended that the calcium be at the lower end of that with the magnesium actually being passed.
Nın ötesinde %20 ve potasyum %15'te olacak ve bu da tam burada yaşamamız gereken sayı. Washington eyaletindeki kumlu balçık topraklarda yetiştirilen elmalar için işte bir tarım uzmanının mahsulünüz için bir besin önerisi oluşturmak için neleri gözden geçirmesi gerektiğini göstermek için hazırladığım tablo. Şimdi bu rakamları ben uydurdum. Bir noktaya değinmek için, yani kelimesi kelimesine almayın ve size gübre tavsiye etmenin yanlış yolunu ve daha iyisini göstereceğim. Gübre tavsiye etme yolu. Şimdi benim bir tarım uzmanı olduğumu varsayalım. Yani mahsulün besin maddesi gereksinimlerine ya da mahsulün ne olduğuna bakıyor olabilirim. Sezon için yetiştirmek gerekir. Şimdi bakıyor olabilirim. Toprakta kullanılabilir besin maddesi ve bu iki sayıyı çıkarırsam şu sonuca ulaşırım. Bu sayı, ki buna meyilli olabilirim. Mahsulümün tam da buna ihtiyacı olduğunu düşünüyorum. Yani eğer devam edip başvurursam, bu besin maddelerini toprağa verdiğimde, bir önceki slaytta gösterdiğim gibi optimum aralığın dışında bir baz doygunluk yüzdesi yaratıyor olabilirim. Ve bu iyi olmaz çünkü bu durumda kalsiyumun sadece %20 baz doygunluğuna sahip olursunuz. Dolayısıyla kalsiyum alımınız sınırlı olacaktır çünkü bu oran optimum aralığın dışındadır. Şimdi bunu yapmanın daha iyi bir yolu bir gübre karışımı önermek olacaktır. Toprakta oluşturacağınız taban doygunluğunu dikkate alır. Bu durumda bunu görebilirsiniz. Bazen besinleri tavsiye etmeniz gerekir. Ürününüzün gerçekte ihtiyaç duyduğundan çok daha fazlası ve bazı durumlarda ihtiyaç duyduğunu düşündüğünüzden daha azı. Ancak sonuçta toprağınızı dengelemiş olursunuz. Böylece besin maddelerinizin çoğu optimum aralıkta veya buna yakın olur. Ve bu senaryoda kalsiyumunuzun ürüne alımını optimize etmiş olursunuz. İzlediğiniz için çok teşekkür ederiz. Bu bölüm 8 bölümümün 6.'sı. Nın ötesinde %20 ve potasyum %15'te olacak.